Let's talk about how to pick colors and yarn for gnomes. How do you know which yarn to use and which colors are going to turn out to make you happiest? Well, I can't guarantee you perfect happiness, but I can give you a few tips to help you. We're going to talk about three things today. We're going to talk about kinds of yarn, weights of yarn, and colors. So let's get started. Quick thing about toy knitting. Toy knitting is something where we need to have a fairly dense gauge. We don't want the stuffing to show through that between stitches, so that when we stuff it, it's not so loose that we're seeing the stuffing gaping through, or any weighted stuffing that we put in is escaping through. That's one thing. So we're knitting it tighter. So generally you want something that's going to have a little more bounce because it's going to be a little easier. Now, if this is going to be a toy, washability is going to be something you might want to think about. So if you're using a wool, because wool has great bounce, it's just one of its best features is the way it feels and the way it works with texture and stitches and just sort of is really compliant. So you might want to pick a superwash wool if you think it's going to be a toy. Cotton can be really great, but also very hard on some people's wrists at the gauge you need to knit in order to make a toy. And acrylic can be a great resource as well if you're looking for it. So you've got your kind of yarn, your cotton or your acrylic or your wool. You've narrowed that down. So how do you pick a weight? Well, all of my patterns were written so that you'd use fingering weight with them, at least when I filmed this. There are also recommendations for worsted weight and DK and other things in some of them. And I'm working right now on a database where every time somebody who knits one with a different weight yarn that I recommend, if they want to, they can submit this to the database, because how do you know what needles to use? How big will the gnome be if you knit it in a different size? And how much yardage will you use? So we're currently working on that. And in the description below, you will find a link to the spreadsheet where you can see some of that information. So for instance, this is gnome de plume knit in fingering weight. This is gnome de plume knit in DK weight. If you're going to change needle size or if you're going to change yarn size from what I recommend, here's two things you'll need to know. Number one, you won't be able to trust the yardage I give you, so you'll have to have extra on hand. It's better safe than sorry. The second thing you'll need to know is that you'll obviously need to change needle size, because if I had tried to knit this gnome with the needles I used for this, talk about wrist pain. So how do you know which needles to start with? I recommend you start with needles 2 sizes smaller than those listed on the ball band. So start there. If you are a loose knitter, you might want to go even farther down from that. If you are a tight knitter, maybe go only 1 down from that listed on the label. Then play around a little bit. Knit yourself a little bit of a swatch, and then stuff some fluffy stuffing up in there and see if you can see the stitches. You're looking for a yarn or a fabric that is stiff enough that is not just going to flop over on you. You want it to have a little bit of body. I'm not talking bulletproof though. And you're also looking so that when you stuff it moderately, not like hugely full, that it doesn't show the stuffing through. So those are my guidelines for that, and the link below will also help you. Choosing color is definitely the place where the most fun can be had. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of my ideas. One is just play around and stack the yarn. Since most gnomes are made up of a hat, a beard, and a body, you can just grab 3 colors at the very beginning and just stack them. So let's assume I'm going to use this as my beard color. I'm going to stack it in the middle. And then I'm going to try, what would this be like as a hat? What would be this like as a body? Do I like these 3 in this order? Because the way gnomes present visually is sort of like a sandwich. So I would stack this and go, well, okay, maybe not. Maybe I'm gonna go more like tone on tone. What about something like this? Do I like that? I personally often like the darker color on the bottom, kind of grounding it, so maybe that would be better. So sometimes you'll find, if you ever see me in a yarn festival or a yarn shop and I'm doing this, it's probably because I'm trying to think, would this work as a hat or a body? So I'll do something like this. So stacking can be good. If you have them wound up into little mini skeins, you can actually just stack them. And if you're doing that, they're really great to photograph. And I would recommend that if you're not sure which color combinations you like, you grab your phone, you take a picture of color option 1, take a picture of another color option, take a deep breath and then actually look at the pictures, because often even like look at them really small on your grid. Don't even open them full size. Just like look at them amidst all the other photos, and you might find that like from a distance, all of a sudden there's something about the camera that gives an objectivity where you're like, oh no, I really prefer this over this, or I don't like that at all, or I still don't know. They'd make two gnomes. One thing I do want to talk about is solid versus semi-solid versus variegated. So a solid is a pretty easy thing to understand. This is solid red, right? It's all red. This yarn is a semi-solid. It is mostly green, and from a distance it might read as a solid, but up close it has some dance and play. There's some darker bluish greens, some lighter emerald greens. And so we've got a solid, we've got a semi-solid, and then there's something called variegated or speckled, and they kind of fall into the same class in terms of the information I'm about to give you. So variegated is one where, rather than reading like the same color from a distance, it's going to be clear that it's made up of component different colors. And this one has got variegation is a high contrast. So this is a speckled yarn. It's got little blips of color, and there are some places that have more than others. And the thing that I'd like you to consider when you are dealing with variegated or speckled yarns is how high contrast it is, how attention getting the combos are, because depending on the gnome and the yarn, they're going to compete. So in a simple gnome like this, solid yarns work pretty much the way you'd expect. But there's nothing to compete with the yarn in this one, so why don't we add a high contrast? Now this isn't the greatest high contrast example, but you can see here, same gnome, different effect because we've got the yarn playing more role, because the knitting itself is simple. In another example with this cabled gnome, this is a prototype I did to see if a medium contrast variegated yarn would work, or a speckled yarn. And this is the one that I ended up using as the official sample. And I don't say that I dislike the more variegated one, but this gnome is a fair amount of work. This cable, this texture requires attention, and you have to really focus in the middle because of the way the texture pops up, and you have to knit the pearls and purl the knits, and it's a lot of work. And if you feel like this hides it afterwards, you might be disappointed. So you might want to stick with a solid or semi-solid. In another example, Gnome de Plume here has, I've used speckled yarns in the sample, which is unusual for me, but the gnome design is fairly straightforward and very graphic, and the body is plain. So you can see the difference here. But this just reads as mostly pink. Even though I've used some speckle here, this pink yarn is fairly cohesive and solid, even though there's a little bit of interest. I would not have done this yarn as this hat, but that's my preference. I'm just giving you information so that you can figure out what you do actually like. Maybe you do like wild yarns with wild patterns. Then more power to you. Make sure you do that when you knit gnomes. So I hope this helps you. Think about using the right fiber for your wrists, basically. Think about getting the needle size right when you are changing the yarn size, and play around with colors. If you are on Ravelry, if you go to any one of the gnome patterns and click on projects at the top in the tabs there'll be a project page, and you can click through and see hundreds of different gnomes. And even just browsing there or going the Never Not Gnoming hashtag on Instagram will give you a lot of variety, and you can go, oh, I'm constantly drawn to earth tones. Oh, I really like it when they have high contrast hat body, and you'll get a sense of the things that make you happy. But remember, there's really no wrong way to gnome as long as you like your gnome in the end.